The disparities in health outcomes among people of varying socioeconomic statuses are well documented in medical literature. While many people think that this has to do with the availability of health insurance and health care for those of lower socioeconomic statuses, this also has much to do with the allostatic load, which is, in a sense, the physical degradation that happens in response to social and environmental stress. In short, somebody who is a part of a disenfranchised population is more likely to be unhealthy than a person who is not a part of a disenfranchised population simply because of the stress they experience every day from discrimination. Physicians don't often know what to do about this. They only know to give somebody medications and don't know what to do when medications won't help. Through art, we can explore the dynamics of power in various populations throughout time. The three we are exploring in this seminar are women, those with HIV and AIDS, and those with mental illnesses. We explore the dynamics of power in social climate and government, as well as identity and oppression and community. Our hope is that medical students can understand their own role in stopping the cycles of oppression and also perhaps recognize the ways that they contribute to this oppression as well.
The first section of the workshop focuses on the status of women in society and the general opinions on their sexuality over time. To begin this discussion, we will examine the Venus or Woman of Willendorf. This 11-centimeter tall statuette was discovered in 1908 by Johann Wehren in Lower Austria and is one of many so-called Venus figurines from the Paleolithic era. Students will first be asked to examine the statuette and to give their first impressions about what they believe it is and what it could represent. The purpose of this activity is to draw out the students' gut reactions and highlight any potential prejudices or societal assumptions. After discussing the students' own visual observations and interpretations, the discussion will turn to past interpretations of the work. Many of these interpretations focus on depicting the statuette as an anonymous symbol of the ultimate female sexuality and of a fertility fetish of early man, due to the exaggerated proportions of the figure's sex and reproductive organs. More recent medical interpretations assume that the woman depicted is evidence that obesity was a problem even in early 30,000 BCE. Only a small number of documented interpretations suggest that there is nothing sexual or wrong with the figure, but rather that it was created by a woman looking down at her own body and depicting herself. Students will discuss the implications of these interpretations and their own, as they represent the view of women, their value, and assumptions about them or expectations of them, over time and to the present.
Frank Moore is one of the most prolific artists in the field of HIV art. He's described as a visual essayist and a surrealist, and he used silk screens to take objects from other places and tell his own story with it, without confusing the viewer into thinking that he made that himself. As he became HIV positive, so his work reflected that. He sought to end the demonization of HIV, and his work all has a thread of hope in it, even those themed with HIV, and even those that featured his partner who died of AIDS-related complications. Frank Moore was instrumental in Visual AIDS, a group that focuses on HIV-positive artists and advocates for the use of their art to tell the story of the crisis. He was especially instrumental in the creation of the Archive Project, which provided free photo documentation of the art of artists who were HIV positive so as to remember the crisis. In Bubble Bath specifically, viewers come face to face with a lot of uncomfortable images. First of all, we see that the work is framed by a water pipe. This conjures up ideas of the flow of the disease and transmission, and even the flow of ignorance that led to homophobia and other discrimination, and even calls for the quarantine of those who were hemophiliacs, homosexual men, intravenous drug users, and sex workers. We also see a bottle of antiretroviral medication used to treat HIV/AIDS. We see a used condom. We see references to sperm banks. And we also see drawings of sex acts. This is something that medical students must become comfortable with, talking about sexual activity and understanding which sexual activities are more dangerous than others. We need to end the shame of sexuality if we're ever going to move on from this crisis. Medical students need to also understand the HIV/AIDS crisis in order to be sensitive to the thousands of people who are still alive today who were alive during the HIV/AIDS crisis, as well as the many more who are affected by it, be it by having the diagnosis themselves or those who have family members and friends and loved ones who have the diagnosis. The HIV/AIDS crisis still exists today. Of course, there's still no cure for HIV, and discrimination against particularly homosexual men still exists. We also see some interesting parallels to the immigration crisis. We see that discrimination repeats itself. In the early HIV/AIDS crisis, we saw that there was this terrible disease that we didn't understand, and it tended to happen to homosexual men, among other groups of people. Society came to a conclusion that this must have something to do with being gay. As such, homophobia became very prevalent in society. Similarly, with the immigration crisis, we've come to a false association between those who are Muslim and terrorism. As such, we've stripped people of their human rights still and continue to discriminate against those who are Muslim, even though this association that we have with terrorism is false. Physicians have changed their care throughout these decades from the HIV/AIDS crisis. It wasn't until 1987 that the American Medical Association declared that physicians had an ethical duty to treat patients with HIV and AIDS. This meant that beforehand, not all physicians thought that they had an ethical duty to treat these patients. Similarly, governments don't always follow along with what we've found in the scientific community to be most helpful. One example is that needle exchanges are not legal in every state of the United States, despite the fact that the American Medical Association and the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health have said that needle exchanges are a huge tool for reducing the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. Furthermore, accessibility of health insurance and health care is very limited for those who are HIV positive, especially if they're also dealing with a co-occurring disorder or dealing with poverty and homelessness. Frank Moore set a great example in terms of documentation and remembering these tragic events. If we forget this, we will repeat it. And we see that we still have already repeated it.
So going off that, we will now take the time to explore some mental health aspects seen in Joan Mitchell's painting Rock Bottom and in Marginalized Communities. Joan Mitchell was an American abstract expressionist artist. She was based in a small town in France for the majority of her adult life, starting about mid-late into her art career, during which time she developed her signature style of abstract expressionism that included French influences. However, it wasn't until near the end of her career and life that people considered what her art truly said about her mental state. Many art critics described her paintings as violent and turbulent, which pegs the question, was it okay to let Joan continue her art knowing that her mental health was deteriorating? Her painting, Rock Bottom, is exhibited at the Blanton Museum of Art, and though it is praised for his ability to show Joan's emotions, it wasn't until much later that people found out that her talents stemmed from the fact that she was an eidetic synesthete, meaning that she could remember every detail of the past as vividly as the present. This allowed her to utilize her memory of such things such as letters, sounds, and people, and able to express them in color along with her emotions. Underlying all of that was hidden alcoholism, depression, and seasonal affective disorder. Knowing this, it can be inferred that Mitchell used her art as a form of art therapy. Similar to Mitchell, many accomplished artists with psychiatric disorders have expressed themselves and their emotional distress through their art and work. Art therapists have also used the visual arts to help clients understand their problems and cope with them. While art therapy started with mental health institutions, many therapists can be found in a variety of settings, including medical and psychiatric hospitals, clinics, and outpatient treatment facilities. However, marginalized communities and disenfranchised communities are placed at a disadvantage to receive this kind of treatment due to factors such as lack of transportation, accessibility, and affordability, and education. But to understand why these marginalized and disenfranchised communities don't receive this kind of treatment, we first have to understand that it stems from health and healthcare disparities. Firstly, health disparities are things such as differences in nutrition and life expectancy, and healthcare disparities are things that are flaws in our healthcare system, such as inability to get medical insurance and what that medical insurance covers. And though these aspects are neutral in a sense, they become a disadvantage when taking into account social determinants. Social determinants such as things as housing policies, gentrification pressures, food access, employment opportunities, and including transportation, all are social determinants that affect health, thus creating marginalized and disenfranchised communities, which in turn disproportionately affect their mental health wellness as a result. Some statistics to consider is the fact that the biggest benefiters of mental health services among adults are white/Caucasian population, and the least benefited are Asian populations. The LGBTQ community also suffers a higher rate of mental illness and stress, including a higher rate of suicide and higher rates of discrimination. Keeping all this in mind, it's important for medical professionals to better understand the complexities of mental health, and in particular the barriers facing marginalized and disenfranchised communities, to better serve them because they are the ones who need it most.
We're now going to do an activity to explore the various places that all of us have power and where we don't. Through this activity, we'll be able to see the different experiences that everybody has and hopefully be able to understand how the privilege that we have in various areas intersects. Please feel free to stay seated when you hear a statement, even if it is true for you if you don't feel comfortable standing up. And please stay quiet as we do this. And remember, this is not meant to shame anybody, but rather to explore the ways that our privilege interacts with other areas of privilege. If I want to, I can easily find a religious community that will not exclude me because of my sexuality. I can assume that I will have easy access into any building. I was raised in a single-parent household. I have had to skip meals because my family did not have enough money to buy food. I cannot find Band-Aids at a conventional drugstore that match my skin tone. My religious views are reflected by a majority of elected officials. My family owned the house where I grew up. I have health insurance. If I wanted to, I could travel freely to almost any country. One or more of my parents has a degree. So now we're going to do a self-reflection. I encourage you to write this down and to reflect on it throughout your schooling and also throughout your career. Where do you see in yourself places where you can grow in being sympathetic towards and culturally competent towards marginalized communities? And this can include places that you feel yourself reflected in these marginalized communities, and also the limitations and cultural humility that you're going to have going forward.